Margaret Hartford sat in her wheelchair on the stone terrace of her father's estate, watching the autumn leaves drift down like golden memories. She was 28 years old, though sometimes she felt much older. The accident had happened 6 years ago, a riding mishap that left her paralyzed from the waist down. Her father, Richard Hartford, CEO of Hartford Industries, had spared no expense. The best doctors, the finest therapists, experimental treatments from around the world. Nothing had worked. Her long blonde hair caught the afternoon light as she gazed across the manicured gardens. She wore a simple peach-colored dress, the kind her mother used to say brought out the warmth in her eyes. But Margaret rarely felt warm anymore. She felt like a bird in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury but unable to truly live. That's when she first saw him. James Mitchell was kneeling in the rose garden, his hands deep in the dark soil. He wore a simple gray t-shirt and worn jeans, and there was something about the gentle way he tended the plants that caught her attention. Her father had mentioned hiring a new groundskeeper, someone local who needed the work after losing his family's farm to debt. Margaret watched him work for several minutes before she realized he was speaking softly to the roses. "You're talking to the flowers," she called out, surprised by the sound of her own voice. She hadn't initiated a conversation with anyone in weeks. James looked up and she noticed his kind brown eyes and the slight embarrassment on his face. He stood slowly, brushing the dirt from his hands. "Yes, ma'am," he said, walking closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "My grandmother always said plants grow better when you treat them like friends." "I know it sounds foolish." "It doesn't," Margaret said quietly. "It sounds kind." Over the following weeks, James became a fixture in Margaret's daily routine. Each afternoon, she would position her wheelchair near wherever he was working, and they would talk. He told her about growing up on his family's small farm, about losing it when his father got sick and the medical bills piled up. He spoke without bitterness, only a quiet acceptance that life sometimes took unexpected turns. "After we lost the farm," James said one day while pruning the hedges, "I thought my life was over. Everything I knew, everything I'd planned, gone. But then I realized something." "What?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious. "That maybe I needed to lose everything to find out who I really was. Not the farmer's son, not the person everyone expected me to be. Just me." His words settled into Margaret's heart like seeds in fertile soil. As the weeks passed, Margaret began to look forward to their conversations with an anticipation she hadn't felt in years. James never treated her like she was broken. He didn't speak to her with the careful pity that most people used. He asked her opinion about the gardens, about books, about life. He made her laugh with stories about his stubborn mule, Samuel, who had refused to leave even when the bank foreclosed on the property. One particularly beautiful afternoon, with the golden October sun warming the terrace, James set down his pruning shears and approached Margaret's wheelchair. There was something different in his expression, a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Miss Margaret," he began, then paused. "I've been thinking about something. Your father mentioned you haven't been to the back gardens in years, said the paths are too rough for the wheelchair." "That's true," Margaret said softly. Those gardens had been her mother's favorite before she passed. Margaret hadn't seen them since before the accident. James took a breath. "Let me try something, if you're willing." Before she could ask what he meant, he gently scooped her into his arms. Margaret gasped, instinctively putting her arms around his neck. She weighed so little these days, and James carried her as if she were made of spun glass. "Trust me," he whispered. They moved slowly through the estate, past the formal gardens and down a winding path that Margaret remembered from childhood. James walked carefully, narrating what he saw so she could close her eyes and just listen. "The maple trees are at their peak. There's a cardinal singing in the oak. Your mother's garden bench is still here, weathered but strong." When Margaret opened her eyes, tears were streaming down her face. They were in her mother's secret garden, the place where she'd learned to love growing things, where she'd shared her dreams and fears with the woman who'd understood her best. James sat down on the bench, still holding her, and they stayed there in comfortable silence as the afternoon light turned amber. "Thank you," Margaret finally whispered. "I didn't realize how much I needed this." "Sometimes," James said gently, "we can't walk the path alone. But that doesn't mean we can't travel it." Something shifted in that moment. Margaret realized she'd been so focused on what she'd lost that she'd stopped seeing what remained. Her mind still worked. Her heart still felt. Her spirit, though wounded, was still capable of joy. Over the next several months, James carried Margaret to different parts of the estate, places she'd convinced herself she'd never see again. Her father, watching from his study window, saw his daughter smile more in those months than she had in 6 years. But more importantly, Margaret began to heal in ways that had nothing to do with walking. She started painting again, setting up an easel on the terrace. She began writing letters to old friends she'd pushed away. She asked James to teach her about plants, and soon she was planning garden designs from her wheelchair, directing him with an enthusiasm that surprised them both. One spring morning, nearly a year after they'd met, James found Margaret on the terrace with an unusual expression on her face. "I felt something," she said quietly. "In my left foot. Just a tingle, but something." James knelt beside her wheelchair, taking her hand. "That's wonderful. But Margaret, even if nothing changes, you know that doesn't define your worth, right?" She smiled, really smiled. "I know, you taught me that. You showed me that moving forward doesn't always mean walking. Sometimes it means opening your heart again." Richard Hartford stood in the doorway, unnoticed, watching the poor farmer who'd worked miracles no expensive doctor could achieve. Not by making his daughter walk, but by helping her live again. By treating her not as a tragedy to be fixed, but as a person to be known. Sometimes the greatest kindness we can offer isn't a cure. It's simply seeing someone, really seeing them, and loving them exactly as they are. And sometimes that's when the real healing begins. Margaret did eventually regain some feeling in her legs. The doctors called it remarkable. But she and James knew that.